Okay, so welcome to the show. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey, and blah, blah, blah. I'm still dealing with COVID a little bit, so just bear with me. Maybe this is a kind of brain fog episode. This is going to be the episode on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, and I'm just going to zero in on the chapters or books 8 and 9, which is about friendship. I would say the whole book is a good read. It's one that you should maybe read in your late 20s or so. I'm not a big Aristotle. Look at this piece of hair. My goodness. I remember reading this in my late 20s and kind of enjoying it. It's readable. It's readable for Aristotle. So first of all, if you're going to read Aristotle, I would say start, maybe with the Politics, which a lot of you are interested in. But this is a different take, and it's readable, and you can get through it. This is where Aristotle sort of sets out. I think his son was named Nicomachean or something. So this is basically a writing for his son, or maybe his son edited it or something like that. But the idea is, it's to try to figure out what is life about and what are we here for. And Aristotle sort of famously answers this with the idea of eudaimonia, right? So I'm going to get into that in a minute, and then we're going to move into how friendship can help you discover that, or you sort of arrive at that end. So as I say, the Nicomachean Ethics is quite readable, at least compared to his impenetrable physics and metaphysics. This is the work in which he, as I said, lays out sort of a theory or natural telos for human beings. The question is basically how should men live, or rather, more specifically, for what should men live? And the answer he gives is, as I said, pretty well known. It's this famous idea that men should live for eudaimonia. And what's that? Well, it's something like flourishing as what you are. Or like becoming what you are. Translated even more simply, it means happiness, basically. Now, although I haven't read much of Thomas Aquinas, it seems that this is the kind of thinking that laid the groundwork for natural law in a context of ethics. Aristotle realized that human flourishing required a political arrangement. That is to say that the happiness of an individual is somewhat less beautiful and divine than what is good for a polis and a people. So an individual's happiness must be made to coincide with the good of the whole, in Aristotle's view. So from there, Aristotle distinguishes between mere pleasure and this higher virtue of happiness, which involves not merely stimulating the senses in a pleasurable way, but arriving at the realized best version of oneself, which in fact often requires the suppression of mere pleasure, right? So he makes a lot of sort of gestures about self-control in the middle chapters here, and overcoming the attachment to the senses. It's even it's almost like proto-Stoic in that sense, I suppose. Now, what I want to zero in on for this episode is Aristotle's thinking about how friendship figures into all of this, and it does indeed play a key role here. So Book 8 on the Nicomachean Ethics, he calls a dissertation on friendship. And he begins by noting how delightful friendship is and how necessary it is, especially for men in positions of power, by the way. And friendship seems to have salutary effects on men of all ages. It keeps the young from error, he says, and the old, it helps to manage their weaknesses and deficiencies in action. And then those in their prime, it allows to accomplish noble deeds. And if you want to do something great, which, you should, right? But you're going to need help from a friend, Aristotle suggests. And I think he's right about that. And so he adds, it seems to be implanted in us by nature, this instinct for friendship. That is to say, it is a part of why we're here. If you want to fulfill yourself, you want to become what you are as much as possible, have friends. This is part of what it is to be a human and to do it right. Concerning the social element of all this, Aristotle shows how friendship is eminently desirable as a glue that holds the people together. He says, quote, "Friendship seems to be the bond of social communities, and legislators seem to be more anxious to secure it than justice even. I mean, unanimity is somewhat like to friendship, and this they certainly aim at, and specially drive out faction as being inimical. Now, I mean, this is actually a nice little window into what I've never loved about Aristotle. It's like, well, like what he says here absolutely should make sense in a good world. But, what if you live in a perverse civilization where friendship is actually made like difficult and almost even illegal by sort of, the structure of how things work in our civilization? I mean, do you get the feeling that our legislators strongly encourage us to have tight friendships? That's never really been my sense. Most of you have probably had to all leave your childhood friends behind to go to a good college, and then you had to leave all your college friends behind to get your first job, and then probably you moved out to the suburbs and lost another round of friends. And so if you're like me, you have that one true friend in Texas with whom you text and send audio pretty regularly, but you really only get to ever actually hang out every couple years anymore, and that's sort of, I think, pretty typical for a lot of sort of middle-aged men anyway. This certainly does make accomplishing anything great or noble more difficult. And maybe that is sort of the point that our legislators have in mind. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Anyway, this does lead to an interesting idea, that justice is not required for friendship, though if you are just, you will still feel a need for friendship. In other words, this kind of relationship is higher than the goodness that is recognizable as law-abiding. And here, if you've watched my last few episodes carefully, you'll detect a very relevant point. The law cannot make friendships happen. This is a sort of, a moral, spontaneous order, to quote Hayek, I guess, that flourishes under conditions of freedom rather than compulsion. And if you've ever seen like moms who will try to be like charitable with their own children and like make them be friends with other kids, it never works out. They never become like actual lifelong friends for that, right? Aristotle points out that there are many disputes about friendship. For example, do men who are like one another make the best friends? Or is it true what Heraclitus says, that contrariety is expedient, and that the best agreement arises from things differing, and that all things come into being in the way of the principle of antagonism? Empedocles goes the other way, by the way. Like aims at like, he says. Now, Aristotle leaves these questions aside. Instead, he suggests a more philosophical approach. He asks essentially, what is the proper object matter of friendship? That is, like, what is it for, right? And he concludes that it has two chief ends, the good and the pleasurable. The definition gets pretty darned autistic from there, actually. Again, this is why I find Aristotle to be less fun than Plato. He seems to have no sense of humor, and so he makes everything like absolutely explicit. For example, he says, quote, "Well, these are plainly kindly disposed to one another, but how can one call them friends while their mutual feelings are unknown to one another? To complete the idea of friendship, then, it is requisite that they have kindly feelings toward one another and wish one another good from one of the aforementioned causes, and that these kindly feelings should be mutually known." This all just like makes me laugh, and I don't think that was his intention. It's almost like an instruction manual for making friends, and I don't know, maybe this would be useful for certain personality types. I just tend personally to be less mechanical and systematic about social things. But I don't know. On the other hand, this style of thinking does lead to some interesting claims. For instance, Aristotle says that, quote, "They who have friendship for one another desire one another's good." And this seems to be very essentially true to me. I've mentioned on occasion my best friend, the guy who lives in Texas, whom I met in graduate school. He and I have never totally been out of touch for 20 years with each other. And when we first met, I was an atheist, and he was a Texas Protestant. And he converted to Catholicism, And I'm strongly sympathetic to Protestantism now, and he certainly, I mean, he made a few overtures, by the way, when he converted, especially, about me converting to Catholicism or something. But the main thing was that I never doubted for a second that through all of our mutual changes in perspectives and commitments, we both wanted what was best for one another. And if you have that, you have a real friendship, because then you can disagree wildly and still go on believing in one another as loyal companions, right? So I never think worse of him than he might be wrong. That's the only possibility. He doesn't ever wish me ill, even if he has some idea that's different from me. I know that he thinks it's for my own good, and so that, by the way, that makes me take it more seriously, right? But again, return to that distinction between friendship based on pleasure and friendship based on the good. Aristotle says that the first kind tends to change as pleasures change. So yeah, it's easy to make best friends in high school with your second baseman if you're a shortstop, but when you guys hang up the cleats, the friendship may not last. When a couple of friends has a longer view, though, and both men maintain an idea of the good above any particular pleasure, then a long-lasting friendship may come to life, given, Aristotle says, time and intimacy. Or, quote, till they have eaten the requisite quantity of salt together, he says. So if you want to make friends that last, focus on a long-lasting idea of the good. By contrast, Aristotle suggests that the morose and elderly men tend to generate friendships less often. If you are morose, you might still make friends by being profitable or pleasurable to others, but it's unlikely that you'll make long-lasting friendships if you just have a tendency to wallow around and bitch all day about all the bad stuff, okay? So Aristotle catalogs numerous different kinds of friendships. One that's interesting, for example, is when the stations are unmatched. So, for example, the kind of friendship that emerges between a father and a son. Aristotle says, quote, the same results do not accrue to each from the other, nor, in fact, ought they to be looked for. But when children render to their parents what they ought to the authors of their being, and parents to their sons what they ought to their offspring, the friendship between such parties will be permanent and equitable. And that's a nice idea, right? Like, equity needn't be the basis of every relationship. Hierarchies can exist, and when everyone fills their role in keeping with their nature, right? You're the son, so you act like a son, or you're the father, so you act like a father, then a lasting friendship can result, a friendship that ultimately benefits both parties. And the point is especially interesting if you keep in mind that Aristotle, for example, was Alexander the Great's mentor. But at the same time, this isn't to say that equality is of no use. Aristotle suggests it's actually one of the strongest bonds within friendship. He says, quote, equality, then, and similarity are a tie to friendship, and especially the similarity of goodness, because good men, being stable in themselves, are also stable as regards others, and neither ask degrading services nor render them, but, so to say, rather prevent them. For it is the part of the good neither to do wrong themselves nor to allow their friends in so doing. So yeah, I mean, one way to understand friendship is that it is not exploitative. If you have a friend who asks you to do something degrading or destabilizing, that's probably not a real friend. This actually makes me think of when I was in college and I lived with these guys, a lot of guys who I had played sports with in high school. I went to a local college and we were all still living together and stuff. And the thing is, I don't think they wished me ill or anything, but the drinking got to be so outrageous that it did seem to me to be degrading. I think I've said before, I remember one of these guys, I remember waking up one time at 3 in the morning to go pee in the middle of the night. And one of my best friends from high school, this guy I was living with, was passed out and naked on the bathroom floor with puke kind of half in the toilet and half on the floor, and he was asleep. And I was just like, I don't want to live like this, and he really wasn't asking me to keep participating like that, but if he had been, I guess that really would not have been a sound basis for good friendship, right? Okay, again, friendship and justice, Aristotle says, have the same object matter, which is goodness. And so if you think in those terms, it makes sense that, as Aristotle points out, quote, in every communion, there is thought to be some principle of justice, and also some friendship. Men address as friends, for instance, those who are their comrades by sea or in war, and in like manner also those who are brought into communion with them in other ways. And the friendship, because also the justice, is coextensive with the communion. This justifies the common proverb, the goods of friends are common, since friendship rests upon communion. Okay, so, I mean, Aristotle obviously wasn't using communion here the way that Catholics do. However, I suspect that, that can be one form of what he's talking about. This may be sort of difficult for us in America to appreciate, since we're told that, by every official outlet that we're in communion with all 340 million of our fellow Americans. But I think what Aristotle is saying is that, involuntary associations in groups dedicated to similar causes, friendships will tend to emerge because they have a shared vision of justice. I remember reading in his Politics, actually, that Aristotle thought a polis, or a city-state, should be no bigger than 100,000 people. And at a scale like that, maybe it is imaginable that you could have an entire society where friendship flourishes. The very, very normal, healthy idea here is that, quote, the friendships of men of the same city, or tribe, or crew, and all such, are more peculiarly, it would seem, based upon communion, inasmuch as they plainly exist in right of some agreement expressed or implied. Among these, one may rank also the friendship of hospitality. Okay, in the next section of this dissertation on friendship, Aristotle makes a note on the various regimes, basically the ones described in Plato's Republic in Book 8. Although he amends Plato's description here a little bit, just sort of, like the timocracy. There's at least one sort of semi-substitution here, but whatever. He's making the case that the corresponding forms of friendship with each of the regimes, will sort of attend any given political constitution. Because again, friendship is exactly coextensive with the principle of justice for Aristotle. So if you've ever wondered why, for instance, male mentor-style friendship is hard to come by in America, it's because that's the form of friendship proper to aristocracy, which involves hierarchy and the recognition of excellence, and America just isn't that, right? Now, Aristotle does address the potential for quarrels among friends, but he steers readers back to the idea of seeking goodness. He says, quote, fault-finding and blame arises either solely or most naturally in friendship of which utility is the motive. For they who are friends by reason of goodness are eager to do kindnesses to one another, because this is a natural result of goodness and friendship. And when men are vying with each other for this end, there can be no fault-finding nor contention. Again, in theory, I like this idea, and it does seem to be the glue that has held together my best friendships. But it's very rare, isn't it, to find men who are relatively equal to you in station and who are also truly dedicating their lives to the good. I guess the lesson is, if you find one of these guys, try to rise to the challenge. Try to outdo him in good doing. That's the best possible foundation for a good and lasting friendship. Was I right earlier to suggest that a certain amount of anarchism is the richest sort of soil for forming friendships? Well, I mean, kind of, right? In a democracy, yes. But Aristotle suggests that in unequal friendships, where the station or status of the two individuals is not precisely equal, these friendships actually should be governed by certain kinds of rules. One quick example. The superior man, Aristotle says, quote, should receive more respect, and the needy man more profit. And this is why it's correct for VDR to send me things in the mail, and my job is just to defer to his authority and honor his judgment and tell you to subscribe to his channel and so on. This is because friendship requires what is possible, not strictly what is due. This being not possible in all cases, as in the honors paid to the gods and to parents. No man could ever make the due return in these cases, and so he is thought to be a good man who pays respect according to his ability. That's pretty much the end of Book 8. But Aristotle does take the inquiry on friendship into the next chapter, so just a couple of notes on that portion. First, Aristotle thinks through the possibility of deception or false friendship, and this is kind of an interesting section to me. So quoting here, he says, "But a man has reason to find fault if the other party, being really attached to him because of advantage or pleasure, pretended to be so because of his moral character. In fact, as we said at the commencement, the most common source of quarrels between friends is their not being friends on the same grounds as they suppose themselves to be." Continuing, "Now, when a man has been deceived in having supposed himself to excite the sentiment of friendship by reason of his moral character, the other party doing nothing to indicate this, he has but himself to blame. But when he has been deceived by the presence of the other, he has a right to find fault with the man who has so deceived him, aye, even more than with utterers of false coin, in proportion to the greater preciousness of that which is the object matter of villainy." That is to say, if you're to, abuse someone by pretending to be their friend, just to extract something useful or pleasurable out of them, that is comparable to, what do they call that? Coin shaving, right? It's fraud. It's right up there with the worst of sins, according to Dante, as I think I pointed out in a few videos long ago. So anyway, this is sort of a tough one for me, though. I remember actually in the weeks before 9/11 in 2001, I had just started grad school in, English. I had been there like 3 weeks, I guess, right? Because you would start in like late August. But I had made 0 friends. And this had never been a problem for me until that point in my life. But here, I guess it was as if no one appreciated my moral character. They were all blue-haired progressives, and I was a jock wearing a Ralph Lauren polo shirt. However, it was around mid-September or so that a friend finally introduced himself, my still best friend, the guy from Texas that I mentioned now and then. And right away, I felt that I had played my hand correctly. Just keep showing up, keep sitting there, keep reading, keep dressing the way that you always dressed, and someone will think to honor that. Soon enough, my friend and I were talking about Soviet communism and playing Civilization 3 and even sharing a pipe together and doing the dialectic, and all was well. But I've also been approached, rarely, but it's happened, by people who sort of mark me as a sucker, I guess, or befriend me for the wrong reasons, to take some sort of advantage. Snakes in the grass. Come on, wolves in sheep's clothing. And Aristotle even presses this one point further by questioning whether a man who takes up another as a good man is bound to continue in the friendship with him, even if the man turns out to be a scoundrel. So it's possible that mistaken judgment happens at the outset of the friendship, and Aristotle proposes that in these cases there's no real obligation to continue in the friendship. And I'll add another possibility for a sort of false or misfired friendship here, and that is where the conception of the good is fundamentally not shared. It's really interesting to think about how people navigate all this, and to think about the kinds of signals they send. I actually remember in my 20s, I tried inwardly to maintain a pretty honorable stoic sense of justice and goodness, but in order to make myself sort of relatable, I tended to dress down And so like maybe this could be attributed to me as a fault because it might have given someone the impression that I was a democratic man when in fact I was aspiring to be an aristocratic man, right? So the signals may get slightly crossed. And friendship there would be more difficult. It seems possible anyway. All right, well, let's see. Anyway, Aristotle kind of rambles on and on about friendship through the end of Book 9. As I've hinted, he seems autistic to me, and that makes this not so much my favorite sort of thing to read, to be honest. Nevertheless, friendship does assuredly seem worthy of philosophical consideration. There is certainly something mysterious in friendship, right? About how it forms and how it is maintained and all of that. I've always had the sense that the very few close friends I've had were sort of given to me in a way that feels like divine, right? Well, actually, before I get to my wrap up here, yesterday I spent half of the day just looking at old. If you go on Google Scholar, you could put in custom dates for searching, articles. So I was searching for articles on Plato from 1900 to 1930, basically to see what people were saying in the generation before Leo Strauss about Plato, to be honest. Because one of the things that Strauss will say is that there's sort of reason and then there's revelation. And in his mind, the philosophical tradition is the Western tradition, whereas it's like Judaism and Christianity are of the East, are of Jerusalem, and so on. But of course, as I've pointed out so many times, that is not what the consensus on Plato was before 1950, and it's not what it has been since then. You might even say that research into Plato hit a low point in the middle of the 20th century, and it was because people were so kind of in the, World War II and suburbs kind of mindset, and they just had lost any conception of true mysticism. So if you read your E.R. Dodds or your Peter Kingsley and others, and by the way, there are really good articles I posted in my Twitter feed yesterday. I'll try to leave them up until you find them, about this kind of thing, even from, Indian scholars who are agreeing with me. And the idea is that it's okay, first of all of Greek thought begins in poetry, right? It's Orpheus and, Homer, who are at the start. It's poets. It's the muses giving them these irrational, or not irrational, but not, they didn't reason their way through writing the Odyssey, right? And then when you read Heraclitus and Parmenides, certainly, and Empedocles, and read Peter Kingsley's book. No, none of you have read that book yet. But if one of you orders the book Reality by Peter Kingsley, in fact, I'll do an episode on it next or soon, after my Galatians episode. If you read that book, I defy you to make the Leo Strauss case on Plato that he's just a pure atheist, materialist, politician, rationalist, because he's not. He's clearly the sort of last proper representative of mystic-inducing shamans. Plato was the last one, and this is why I say I don't love reading Aristotle, because in Aristotle I don't detect it. Maybe in his esoteric teachings, maybe in the academy itself, he was able to do it, but the stuff he wrote down, it does not provoke the big conversion, the big mental realignment that I think Plato's dialogues do, that Socrates certainly undertook at the initiation cults, in Delphi or wherever, Eleusis. And so anyway, I don't know, you guys, but just be wary what you believe, and the best policy is just to read this stuff yourself. Stop, I don't know. Yesterday, I saw this Michael Millerman video where he's reading some contemporary critic on Leo Strauss on Plato, and Millerman is presenting it to you. That puts 3 or 4 layers of mediation between you and the Plato. And it's just open Plato and read it. It's not that inaccessible. It really isn't. Just read it carefully, and you'll find that especially if you read 3 or 4 or 5 of the dialogues, you start to catch what's going on. That's all there is to it. You can do it, okay? That's how Leo Strauss did it. You can do it, okay? Whatever, though. I'm going to wrap this episode up a little early because COVID seems to have gotten stuck in my face a little bit, and I don't love the way my sinuses feel. One last point, I guess. It does sort of bother me that I had COVID in February of 2020 and now got it again in October 2021, about 18 months apart. Now, I'm not vaccinated, but given how communicable it seems to be, I expect this is more or less what we're all looking at for the rest of our lives, one COVID infection every 18 to 20 months or so. And that's pretty fucking annoying, given that it was clearly engineered and released by some, elites in order to generate massive profit opportunities for international pharmaceutical companies. They're not exactly demonstrating their high time preference credentials there, are they? Anyway, if you want to support the show, the Patreon link is in the description. And guys, wouldn't it be cool if we made it to 1,000 subscribers just as I post video number 100, the next one, which will, of course, be a close reading of Paul's letter to the Galatians. I strongly encourage you to read it before my episode. It's 6 chapters, and it takes 26 minutes to read. You can do it. You can do it, okay? Read it carefully. We're almost there, guys. We almost made it. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.